Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. I'm Matt Hollander in Chicago, one quarter of the Lee weather team, but got the whole gang here today. Meteorologist Joe Martucci, based in Atlantic City, Sean Sublett in Richmond, Virginia, and Kirsten Lang out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Together, the four of us cover weather across the country. Yes, not just across the sky, but across the country. And this national weather coverage is new. So if you're listening to this podcast on a Lee Enterprises website or app, you're probably going to be seeing more forecast videos from us, especially when bad weather is expected. But I think it's safe to say this podcast, this is the first thing that went national, and I think it's the favorite part of our jobs, and nothing is changing here. In fact, each week, we continue to see our number of listeners go up. So really, we can't thank you enough for tuning in and subscribing. And this week, just like the national weather story for the last week, this episode is all about Hurricane Idalia. The damage is still being assessed, but it is clear that this was another devastating storm for parts of the Southeast. And of course, right off the bat, our thoughts and prayers are with all the people trying to recover from this storm. Now, obviously, lots to discuss here, but to start, guys, let's just go around the horn and talk about the first thing that stood out to you about Idalia. Sean, let's start with you because you were doing a lot of updates on this storm for our Carolina properties.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things that I take home from Idalia is actually how well it was forecast. You know, we are in an environment, you know, we've been talking about this for a few months now. We've got very high ocean heat content, high sea surface temperatures, basically warm water, but we've had the El Nino going on. And there's this whole battle back and forth between the two. Which one of these impacts is going to be larger? And we kind of said, well, once things get started, they can really, really go. And that's kind of what happened. I mean, the Gulf of Mexico was especially warm, and it is not common for the National Hurricane Center to talk about rapid intensification in their discussions, in their technical discussions, as this environment is primed for rapid intensification. And by that, we mean something very specific, effectively going up 2 categories in 24 hours. I mean, technically it's 35 miles per hour in 24 hours, but 2 categories, right? So for them to be talking about rapid intensification with such high confidence, then it comes to fruition pretty much as forecast. I mean, their track was spot on. But, you know, it's tough. You know, you're looking at just this blob of clouds in the Yucatan Channel, and you're thinking 36 hours, this is going to be a major hurricane. That is not a forecast you can make 15 or 20 years ago with any kind of confidence. So for me, I'm especially happy with how far we have come in intensity forecasting in the last 5 or 10 years. You're on the coast, Joe. Now, I know this is not your storm, obviously, but what kind of things were you thinking about?
I was thinking about this is another instance where the surge was the biggest deal with this. And kind of I've been thinking about this for the past month, like the Saffir-Simpson scale. Is that the best way of categorizing hurricanes? I'm not trying to like open a can of worms on the podcast, but you know, you got something that, and I just read a tweet by Greg Postel from the Weather Channel about how there really was nothing more than tropical storm for sustained winds on any land observing site with this storm, even though it was a hurricane. So, you know, if that were to be true, well, it wasn't a category 3 at landfall by technicality, because you would have to have something that was over 74 miles an hour sustained winds. But the impacts of the storm were, you know, like a category 3. I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, is there a better way to categorize hurricanes that take into account the surge, you know, the flooding, the pressure, maybe, or even the, you know, taking winds into account too, because it's all comes back, you know, again, just being at the Jersey Shore comes back to Superstorm Sandy, which was a category 1, you know, at landfall, but, you know, the damage did not feel like a category 1 at the Jersey Shore. So it's just more of a broader picture for me, you know, with this, you know, can we get to a place, you know, is the Saffir-Simpson scale the best way to do this? Weather Bell, which is known for their weather models, has put out a proprietary criteria to model these kind of storms with categories. I think the Saffir-Simpson scale is great in the sense that we've been using it for such a long time that it makes it easy to compare storm to storm. But sometimes when you got your storm surge, it's like a category 5, but your winds that are like a category 1, well, what, you're going to see category 1, but was it really a category 1? That's my thought.
And Sean, going off your point about the forecast accuracy, I mean, this time in particular, the track forecast was pretty incredible. I looked back, and the first forecast that the National Hurricane Center issued, now the intensity was off. They were only at the time forecasting, I believe it was a category 1 hurricane at landfall. And that was the one thing that did change in this forecast was the intensity. And it looked like, oh, wait a minute, this is going to be stronger and stronger and stronger. So intensity forecast is getting better, but it has room for improvement. But there was very little improvement for the track forecast because actually the National Hurricane Center's first forecast 5 days out was only 10 miles off and where landfall actually happened. Landfall happened at Keaton Beach, and the first forecast was picked to make landfall just 10 miles west of Keaton Beach. And that is remarkable how good that track forecast was 5 days out. And there wasn't a whole lot of shifting. One thing, if you're comparing Idalia to Ian, we did see that shift in the track forecast from north to south with time. This forecast didn't really shift that much. Again, the cone was wider 5 days out and it got narrower and narrower, but it didn't shift much. If you look at all the different forecasts, it kind of bounced back and forth a little bit west to east, but there was no dramatic shift. Like the focus was always on the Big Bend for the worst impacts, and that's where the worst impacts were. So the track forecast just continued to get better and better. The intensity forecast is lagging behind some, but that's getting better as well. But there's definitely a difference between the track forecast and the intensity forecast. And I think when it comes to intensity forecast, I mean, we just keep seeing this happening over and over again, where the models tend to underdo how quickly these things can intensify when all other conditions are right, when you don't have any wind shear, when there's no dry air, when those waters, as they are in the Gulf, just keep getting warmer and warmer, and you have above average sea surface temperatures, which they always are now. Every year we're talking about above average sea surface temperatures in the Gulf. When the conditions are ripe for intensifying, the models continue to just underdo it. And so a lot of these models were peaking it at category 3, but it ended up reaching category 4, now ultimately making landfall because it went through an eye wall replacement cycle right before landfall as a category 3. But it reached category 4, which was higher than what the models were indicating. So I think, from a forecasting perspective, since we're still useful as meteorologists, the models are just a tool. I think being more aggressive in the intensity forecast, going a little bit higher than what the models are saying, is probably the best track when you know that the wind shear is going away. There's no dry air. The water is really warm. Go ahead and be a little bit more aggressive in that intensity forecast. Maybe think about, if the models are saying 110 mile per hour winds, go ahead and forecast 120 mile per hour winds, because this keeps happening, these rapid intensification events and these storms overachieving. So I think that's a good strategy moving forward for intensity forecasts.
So speaking of intensity, I'll segue next into, I think the stat that stood out to me was that there have been 11 I-named storms that have been retired. And a lot of that, it has to do with the time of year that they usually happen, right? I mean, when you start going down through the alphabet, you usually get to an I around peak season. But since 2001, there's been 11 of them. And so Ian, of course, was the last one last season. Of course, they won't come out with whether or not this one's retired until the end of the season, but I'm sure that it'll probably be put on that list as well, given the intensity of it. But I don't have thoughts on that.
Yeah, there's something about the ice storms. You got to watch out for these ice storms. It is getting a little bit ridiculous, like how many times the ice storms have been bad. I mean, you got Ida and Irene and Ian, and how many we've retired. And let's be honest, there's just not a lot of name. We have to come up with a new name every time we retire a name. Like, what I name are we going to come up with next? I think we're scraping the bottom of the barrel here. It's like, I mean, fortunately, it's an international name list. The World Meteorological Organization comes out with these name lists. And so it's not just English names. I believe it's English, Spanish, French. Are those the three?
Those are the big
languages?
three. My understanding is that, the WMO, World Meteorological Organization, who kind of does this, those are the 3 languages that are spoken the most in this part of the world: English, Spanish, and French, especially for the folks in Haiti and Martinique in the Lesser Antilles. So that's why those names are dominant. But you're right, man. It's we're going to run out of I names.
You are along the coast, and you start creeping up, and it's like getting up there in the alphabet. and you've got an eye coming at you, I feel like the chances of you having a stronger storm, I mean, it would freak me out. But that's just being nervous about it, I guess.
Better watch out for that next ice storm.
I know.
Well, and I think, if you're wondering like why ice storms, I think it's just because of, the placement. We tend to get our strongest storms this time of year, late August through September into early October. That's tend to be when the major hurricanes occur. And so we usually get some small storms that aren't much of an issue. Of course, there have certainly been exceptions. Andrew certainly stands out as a major hurricane that was the first storm of the season. But it just seems like oftentimes we get a lot of little baby storms, if you want to call them that, storms that are out in the middle of the Atlantic and don't hurt anyone. And so it just so happens that we often hit the eye storm when hurricane season is peaking. And so sure enough, these ice storms tend to be stronger ones, and the stronger storms tend to occur near the peak of the hurricane season. So I just think it's ice placement on the list. We just work through the names one by one, and it just so happens that we tend to get our strongest storms when we hit the I name. And looking ahead to 2024, if you're wondering what the I name is in 2024, this year it was a female name, so next year it's going to be a male name. It is Isaac. Isaac is the storm, Isaac, Isaac in 2024. And then we've got, again, there are actually 6 name lists that we do. So then in 2025, it's Imelda. 2026, it's Isaias, which I remember that one being tough to do. That one has come up before. It was not retired, so it's still on the list. Then in 2027, it's Imani. And then in 2028, that's as far out as we go, it's Idris. And so then theoretically, Idalia would come up again in 2029 unless it's retired, and I think there's a pretty good chance that it's going to be retired. Not as devastating a storm as Ian overall. The economic impact, the number of lives lost, fortunately, looks like it's going to be lower. But still, I mean, the images coming out just still overwhelming. You can just see, like, there's, again, as we see after every major hurricane landfall, the images of devastation that come out, it's really, really saddening.
It was pretty interesting. I was watching the Weather Channel on Wednesday, and Jim Cantori, the legend, at the University of Florida Research Station in Cedar Key, and you just saw the water just moving ashore. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, yeah, water's moving ashore. That's bad. But then, like, kind of have to put yourself, like, you have a house there, and you're seeing, like, imagine your street, like, even if you don't live at the coast. Imagine your street and you got 3 feet of water just moving down the street and it's not going away, right? Like, that's pretty terrifying to see, really. It's such a hard, this comes back to, like, something I think we've talked about in the past. Like, it's so hard to conceptualize something you haven't seen before. Yeah. And, and if you're in Cedar Key, and that's an area that hasn't had a direct hit from a hurricane, I don't think ever in recorded history going back to the mid 1800s. It's tough to put yourself in that spot, but to see like 3 feet of water or 4 feet of water, whatever it was, is harrowing. I had a friend of mine who lives in St. Petersburg, and he says he's lived there since 2017. He says the worst flooding he saw on his street in St. Petersburg. And then one of his neighbors said they lived there for like 23 years, and that was the worst they had. And they had, the whole street was covered, and it was about anywhere between 6 to 18 inches, which isn't, 6 inches isn't going to get to your house, but 18 inches could. So it's another takeaway from this storm. Also, question for you guys. Have you guys ever read the book Isaac's Storm? Speaking of Isaac.
Yes, I have, and it's a fantastic book. If you are a meteorologist or anybody who's interested in weather, that is a must-read, A young Joe read that book back in the year 2000. It was about the 1900 Galveston hurricane. It was a nonfiction book by Eric Larson. So good read. It shows you, if you have any doubts about, those meteorologists, they're always wrong. It's like when you read that book, you realize how far we've come. And the fact that, the death toll looks like it's going to be as low as it is from this storm tells you how far we have come. Because in that Galveston storm, over 8,000 people died when a Category 4 made landfall. And this time, almost a Category 4 made landfall. Granted, not right over a highly populated area. That obviously helps. But the fact that death toll may end up being less than a dozen people, it tells you that we've come so far in like being able to forecast these things. Because that's what happened in Galveston. They basically had no idea they were about to get slammed by a Category 4 hurricane. There were a few reports, there's a storm in the Gulf. That was it. It was like ship reports. And they didn't know exactly where it was going. So the fact that we can track these things with satellites, keep an eye on, we have planes flying out of them, getting the latest conditions, the computer models that we have now have gotten so good at forecasting where these things are go. The science of meteorology has advanced so much so that hopefully we will never see a death toll like that from a hurricane again. I think it will be tough to do because we've gotten, there's always room for improvement. The forecast can definitely get better. The communication can get better. I think we've reached a point where we can communicate it well enough that we can get the vast majority of people to a safe place and avoid the worst of the storm. So on that note, I think we're going to take a short break, but don't go anywhere. We're going to continue talking about this storm and look ahead to the future. What can we learn from Idalia so we're better prepared for the next hurricane? We'll talk about that right after this break. And welcome back to Across the Sky, continuing our discussion and recap of Hurricane Idalia. And I think we really want to dive into the communication now and how can we better communicate. We always come back to that. We talk about how the forecasts keep getting better and better, especially the track forecast, but the intensity forecast is showing improvement too. But it's useless if we can't properly communicate and talk about how people outside the cone are going to feel impacts as well. And what are those conditions going to be like where the worst occurs? And Sean, you were watching the Weather Channel and something stood out to you.
Yeah. So, I've got on another screen, I've got the Weather Channel on, and I've been watching Cantori do this thing ever since I was an undergrad back in the in the day.
Wait, when was that, Sean?
I said in the
okay.
in the 19 somethings. And look, Cantori is great. I love his passion. I love what he brings. He is very real. And I love the way he covers stuff. And he's obviously been around the block more than once. But he was talking to a guy who owned a condo there at Cedar Key and wondering why he didn't evacuate. And he made the comment, Cantori made the comment right there on camera that we need to do a better job of communicating what the risk is. This guy didn't leave, even though the forecast storm surge was on the order of 10 to 14 feet. And I think it came up to about 7 or 8 feet. So the guy his condo was elevated. So obviously the water rushed underneath of the condo and he was okay because the thing made landfall at low tide. If it had come in at high tide, well, now we have a much different issue, right? And that dude might not have made it. So how can we do a better job of communicating that risk to encourage these homeowners to leave? I mean, and to his credit, Cantori didn't say a bad thing about this guy because this guy, it was fine, right? He was fine and he did what he thought was right. But he was only 2 or 3 feet of water away from probably not still being with us. So I think we've done a very good job at timing and intensity of the storm. But now, I guess the next frontier of this is, yes, communication, but then what we in the business call the mesoscale impacts, right? How high, what time is that? How far inland is that surge going to go? How good can we make that part of the forecast? It's admittedly not awfully difficult to say, okay, in the Big Bend area, there's going to be a 10 to 14 storm surge. I think any one of us can do that without a lot of fuss. But then it takes more time to say, okay, this point on the Big Bend at this time will have 6 or 8 or 10 feet of storm surge because the tide level is going to be this at this time because of full moon and all that other stuff. That's another whole thing to do, right? Of course, that's also, and I'm going to give credit here to the local weather service offices, that's what they do, right? And they do that especially well. So, we could sit back, the Hurricane Center can sit back and give those larger scale things. But man, a lot of what needs to be done is the communication and understanding of what these smaller scale impacts are going to mean. Where precisely is the eye wall going that's going to bring that 100-mile-an-hour gust? Because all of y'all have done this. You've talked about hurricanes with the public, and the people said, well, I've been through a hurricane. And they might have, but they didn't go through the eye wall, so they don't think it's that bad. And obviously, we all know that area around the eye wall is where it's the worst. And if you go through that, you're not going to forget it. Those kinds of things, what Cantori was talking about earlier today there on the Big Bend of Florida, is what kind of sticks with me going forward.
Yeah, Sean, I saw that interview as well. And the one thing that stood out to me, one of the reasons the guy said that he decided to stay is that initially Cedar Key was in the cone, but ultimately Cedar Key was removed from the cone. And so once he wasn't in the cone anymore, he had that sense of, oh, it's going to be okay. Even though they was still communicated, you saw the forecast, like Cedar Key is still going to have huge impacts. There's still going to be, the landfall is not going to be at Cedar Key. Okay, there are absolutely going to be impacts at Cedar Key, a tremendous storm surge. Tremendous wind still, not the worst of the wind, no, but still very strong winds and a life-threatening storm surge situation in particular. So that was still communicated, but because Cedar Key was not in the cone, in his mind, he was safe, even though he wasn't as safe as he really thought. And so I think, again, it comes back to how much focus people put on the cone. And this storm was a great example of how there are impacts well beyond the cone. Look at what happened in Clearwater Beach, in Tampa, in St. Pete. Everybody, at first there was the possibility that, yes, maybe it would hit there, but pretty early on, they were removed from the cone. It's like, okay, look, Tampa and Clearwater, they get lucky again. But there were impacts. In fact, record storm surge in Clearwater Beach, 4 feet of storm surge that actually still flooded homes. And they were not in the cone, but they absolutely felt impacts from this storm. I think this was a good wake-up call for the Tampa St. Pete area, because we saw what happened when a storm made landfall 100 miles away. Can you imagine what it had been like if this storm actually made landfall in Tampa and St. Pete, and how much worse it would have been? We just got a preview of this record storm surge for Clearwater Beach, but imagine if that storm had been a lot closer, how bad it would have been. So I think this is a wake-up call for the Tampa St. Pete area about, get ready. This was another close call. One day your luck is going to run out, though, and things are going to be worse. And again, but coming back to the original message, they weren't in the cone, but they absolutely felt impacts. And how do we communicate to people outside the cone what it's going to be like? Don't let your guard down. This is what you need to be prepared for. That still seems to be the big challenge.
We've been talking about communication forever, right? Really. And I think Katrina was maybe the genesis of a concentrated effort for those in the weather community to really hunker down on the messaging. As far as evacuating and people not evacuating, I mean, it has to do with, one, you think your home is invincible. You're in it all the time. Nothing usually happens to your house. So that's part of it. It's also the, oh, that won't happen to me mentality too, and a lot of this has been studied by psychologists and sociologists over time, and it's hard when, you do evacuate and then not much happens at your place. You're not as likely to evacuate, in the future. I'm assuming the area in the Big Bend of Florida, I know it's not very populated, but there's probably a good amount of people who live there, seasonally. And, if they are there in August for whatever reason, and they live in, let's say, Kentucky or Pennsylvania or whatever, they don't have to deal with this. So this is a new experience for them too. I think also some people just like, it's a thrill, right? You're going man against nature, and people just like that, right? That's probably how we invented fire in some way, shape, or form. So, there is that human element to it, but we have fire now, we have fire, we've done all that, we're advanced enough where we can evacuate, when we're told to, but it is a tough choice. It's a personal choice. I mean, it's tough for a number of people. I understand that.
Yeah. The other thing with me thinking about Katrina, think of the economic situation in a lot of those areas. Some of those people just couldn't leave, and they did not have the means to leave. And that's one of the things that I wasn't even cognizant of, many years ago, is to understand that there's a lot of people who can't. They just can't. They don't have the means, much less someplace to go. And that's another thing that I think a lot of us doing weather communications have had to come to terms with.
But what stands out to me is that nowadays, it used to be an issue, is like, do the people know this storm is coming? Like, were they notified? Did they have any idea? And now, most of the people who do stay behind and survive, like this guy in Cedar Key, he knew what was coming. He knew the storm was coming. It wasn't like he didn't have any way, he had not read it in the paper. I mean, now there's so many ways you can get the information if you're on the internet, your local newspaper, TV. I mean, it is hard not to be notified about these storms. So very rarely do you encounter someone who is literally off the grid and has no idea this storm is coming. they know the storm is coming, but they don't have a good idea of exactly what's going to happen. And then we get into the other reasons of why people leave. And another reason that comes up is people, there are shelters that open up for these storms, but there are concerns about what's available in those shelters. What if they have a family member with special medical needs? And are they going to have the equipment in case they have a medical emergency at that shelter to be taken care of? And is it a shelter that allows pets or not? Because a lot of people do not, they consider the pet a member of the family and they do not want to leave their pets behind. They want to bring the pets with them, but there's concerns about, well, are they going to accept pets at this shelter? And so then that might be a hesitation. And then finally, it's getting the information. Like, I think that maybe what needs to happen is like the shelters being very clear about where the shelters are, what we have available, what we are going to allow and not allow. That might help if there's some communication, like maybe, we're getting better at the forecast communication, people being aware of the storm, but maybe telling people, well, what should I do? Maybe that's where the breakdown is, like, where can I go? Because some people may not have a family member they can go to, just a couple hours away. There's some people it's like, I don't have any family anywhere close or friends anywhere close. I have nowhere to go, so I'm just going to stay. So maybe getting the word out about where people can go to be safe from the storm, maybe that's what we need to do better on.
Yeah, I agree. I think the communication of a storm approaching is obviously not where we're lacking on any of this. I think everybody's well aware of that. I think it's just, as you all touched on, I think it's just people thinking they can write it out and just the unknown. And I hate to say that, it takes having to go through something like that to realize that that's, maybe next time I'd be a little bit more cautious or thoughtful on my actions, and whether or not, I evacuate or not. But yeah, it's just something we're probably going to continue to battle, I guess, as meteorologists, and then emergency management is going to have to, it's something they have to battle as well.
And I think also, where there still can be continued improvement is places that are in the cone, but not at the coast. So much focus is what's going to happen at the coast, and rightfully so, because of the storm surge threat. You have that added threat in addition to the rain, in addition to the wind. But I think sometimes we may just get too carried away. It's like, where's the worst going to be? Which is always like, where is it going to be on the coast? And we saw big impacts in Georgia and South Carolina and North Carolina as well. And though those were covered, and I think they were communicated, there was still not as much focus, a lot of people being impacted. Again, so many more people feel secondary impacts, not the worst of the storm. They're still feeling impacts from the storm, but not the worst. And sometimes we get so caught up in how bad is it going to be at this one specific spot, we forget to keep remembering, especially in the national conversation. I think, at the local levels, there's a little bit different conversation. The local meteorologists talking about how it's going to impact this local area. But from the national media perspective, I think there's sometimes a little too much focus on where is the worst going to be. I don't think there was enough in the national conversation about what the impacts were going to be in Georgia and South Carolina, and the tremendous amount of rain they were going to see. So many places are just seeing 6, 7, 8. I think the highest total so far, just a little over 9.5 inches of rain, and that is absolutely going to cause flooded roads. And this, where this occurred, was an inland area, nowhere near the coast, but there was absolutely flooding, inland flooding away from the coast. So many flooded roads that impacted travel, and the tornado threat. The most incredible video I saw from this storm so far is a video out of South Carolina of a tornado crossing an interstate, picking up a car and flipping. I mean, just Google South Carolina Idalia tornado, and you will come across that video, and it is absolutely incredible. It's amazing those people did not die. I mean, the way that car flipped, was literally picked up and partially landed on another car. It is amazing. Those people were not even seriously injured, from what I gather. They were injured, but not seriously. And the fact that they even survived is remarkable. So we sometimes forget about the tornado threat with these hurricanes too. Again, so much focus on the storm surge, on the strong winds with these hurricanes, but don't forget, usually these hurricanes generate tornadoes as well. And no, they're not EF4, EF5 tornadoes. Still, EF0, EF1 tornadoes, 100-mile-per-hour winds, especially when it's just a tropical storm. And so the winds are coming down. It's like, oh, the wind threat's going down. You still got to watch out for tornadoes, because those can be deadly as well. If you get hit by an EF0, EF1 tornado crossing a highway, those people got extremely lucky. So we can't forget about the tornado threat as well.
The tornadoes, that we did have across the area, we've seen this a couple of times, where, it's always on the east side of the storm with the tornadoes, that we do see. And then in terms of the impacts, with the, you have the surge, and you have the tornadoes, and you have the flooding, and you have the wind. it's a multi-impact storm. I know again, going back to Saffir-Simpson scale, we talk about the winds alone, but in terms of the storm, it's really a multi-impact event. And again, it's when you have a tornado, it just adds to the complexity, because sometimes you get storm surge and a tornado warning at the same time, and you need to figure out where the best place to shelter is. And sometimes being low isn't good, and sometimes being high isn't good either, if you have both going on at the same time. So it's, again, like I said, sometimes a multi-impact event. Otherwise, that's all I have here for the storm.
Yeah, I think this is just a great conversation to have, like getting a group of meteorologists together after a storm like this and just having a conversation and bouncing ideas off of each other. What went right? What went wrong? What can we do better? Well, what did we see with how the models performed? Another thing that stood out to me, the good old battle between the European and the GFS. This is another example.
You went there.
This is another example of the European beat out the GFS. Now, again, the GFS has gotten better, and this does not happen every time. But so many times during these high impact forecasts that get so much attention, oftentimes the European keeps beating the GFS. That keeps coming up. And I just got to wonder, it's like, why haven't we made the GFS model better? The European is not a perfect model. It's not right every time. And there are still examples where the GFS beats the European. That's why we look at all the models. But it just continuously comes up. The European versus the GFS. And once again, the European has a tendency to win out. It's like, what can we do to make the GFS better?
It's absolutely fair to say that the European model was able to latch onto this signal that there would be something a good 24, almost 48 hours before the GFS was able to lock onto that signal. And my understanding, I'm not a numerical weather prediction dude, but my understanding is that, the data assimilation is just simply better. Their first guess field is just better because they put more resources into it, because the European Center only has to do one kind of model, whereas here in the States, we have the global forecast system. We run the HRRR. There are all these different resolution models for air dispersion, pollution dispersion. So I don't want to be one of these people. I don't want this to devolve into like bashing NOAA, because that's not fair at all. They have much more on their proverbial plates than the Europeans do. But yeah, your point is exceedingly well taken. We still need to do better in our modeling system, especially for these high impact tropical events, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're always striving for in meteorology. We want to be as accurate as possible. I feel like, some people, we're always the butt of jokes. It's like, oh, you can just be right 50% of the time, but we're not. We're much more accurate than that, and we're always striving to be better. We realize there's room for improvement. We're always trying to improve. And I think it's conversations like that where we get that improvement. What went right? What went wrong? How can we do better? And so that's why we're having the conversation. It was a great conversation. And obviously, this is a story that's not going away anytime soon. And with that in mind, we want to reach out to you, our listeners. Were you impacted by Idalia? Do you have friends or family who were impacted? If you have a story about this storm or just a comment or thought, share it with us. Send us an email at podcasts@lee.net or leave us a voicemail by calling 609-272-7099. Again, that email is podcasts@lee.net and the phone number is 609-272-7099. We'd love to hear from you. And finally, before we wrap up, looking ahead, we've got a lot of good episodes lined up. We're going to be talking about how weather impacts fantasy football, phone companies, bounce houses. Yes, bounce houses, those things the kids jump in at birthday parties. You would be shocked how many times the wind has blown those things over. So we're going to do a whole episode about that. But next week, we're sticking with hurricanes, and we've got an interesting topic lined up. Joe, do you want to tell folks more about this one?
Yeah, we're talking about how hurricanes, after they pass through an area in the ocean, they actually warmed a deep part of the ocean. It's common knowledge in the weather world that when a hurricane passes through an area, the surface water temperatures get cooler, but we never really looked at what happened deep in the oceans. And yes, the warming in the deeper oceans does have an impact on what happens throughout the rest of hurricane season. So we're talking about that with Sally Warner from Brandeis University in Massachusetts. And we also have Noel Gutierrez Brizuela from UC San Diego. You guys won't be able to actually, we're an audio only podcast, but Noel, I think, had the best, most awesome looking backdrop in Across the Sky podcast history, because he's just showing in San Diego. But we will be chatting with them, and that will be our episode coming out on Monday, September the 11th.
Yes, it was a great background and a fascinating conversation. So looking forward to it. And I think that's going to do it for this week's episode of Across the Sky. But if you enjoyed the show, please like, rate, share, subscribe. I know you hear it from everyone producing digital content, but it really does help us out. So thank you for taking the time to do it. For Lee Enterprises and my fellow meteorologists, Joe Martucci in Atlantic City, Sean Sublett in Richmond, Kirsten Lang in Tulsa, I'm Matt Hollander in Chicago. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and we'll talk to you again real soon.